Hey, what is up? Welcome to this episode of the Wantrepreneur to Entrepreneur podcast. As always, I'm your host, Brian Lofermento, and I am personally very excited about today's guest because this is someone that is brilliant in so many ways, from the mindset stuff behind business to the actual business strategy. This is an entrepreneur who understands the ins and outs of business, of revenue growth, of living a life that's worth living to go along with that business that we all work so hard on. And I will say, before I tell you more about her, that as soon as we saw her website URL, I said to myself, we need to have her on the show because her website, I have no idea how she got this domain, but it's worklesscreatemore.com, which I think is such a cool way to express the vision and the mission that she's on. So let me tell you all about today's guest. Her name is Maureen Considine. She's the founder and CEO of Finding Your Way Coaching. She's a master coach with expertise in income acceleration, business development, sales and mindset, health and healing, and she's also the wealth health creation strategist for entrepreneurs, executives, and other high performers. She's a master manifester. That's what I'm saying. We're going to learn so much from her about how to bring in all the things that we want today. She's a spiritual teacher and gifted healer using mindset and faith to heal herself and others, including her son. What's really cool about Maureen's background, which I'll let her share even more about it, but she has over 35 years of experience in sales and marketing, really tying that business strategy and those tactics to our own personal growth journeys. She's helped hundreds of clients grow their businesses and reach their true potential using her unique, intuitive, and holistic approach. I'm super excited to learn from Maureen here today, so I'm not going to say anything else. Let's dive straight into my interview with Maureen Considine. All right, Maureen, I'm honestly so excited and grateful for you to join us today. First things first, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
Heck yes, I am so excited to learn from you. But before we get into all the nitty gritty of your brilliance, take us beyond the bio. Who's Maureen? How'd you start doing all these amazing things?
Okay, so I honestly, I don't want to say I fell into it, but it was like one step, then the next step. So way back in the beginning in 2009, I had a very simple part-time job, okay? That it really was not that interesting. It was just the right hours, and it allowed me freedom to be at home when I wanted to be at home. Until one day, it got eliminated. And so you get this call from one of the managers saying, we just don't need your job anymore. And it wasn't about the performance at all, but it still kind of hits you in a weird spot, right? It just says, well, that, it still feels funny. So at that moment, it was kind of like, all right, now what do I do? And I started to take a look at things like, all right, what have I been doing? What are some common denominators? Things I've been doing? And it was sales in all different environments. So inside sales, outside sales, different companies, an eyeglass lens company, payroll, construction, all different industries and all different types of sales and marketing. And then it was also coaching. I had been coaching people in the companies that I was working for, as well as outside. So personal and professional. And that's when I noticed, okay, so here's a pattern. And then I decided to create something for myself. That's really what was the driving factor, is I wanted to create something for myself. I became certified in life coaching, business coaching, and health coaching. And then I started the business, and you kind of go, okay, now what? And then you learn, marketing. And then even still, it's kind of a lot of information. So it kind of started from there, and you get out and you start talking to people and you start networking, and the business grows. And that's really how it started for me. And it has evolved ever since into some of the things you were talking about.
Yeah, I love that overview, Maureen, especially because to me, it's that triumvirate that you're talking about of business success and well-being as well as health. And that's so important. We always say health is wealth. And then obviously that personal development journey. I think it's so important, the fact that you marry all three of those. It's something, as I've gotten older, it's the more I appreciate that these things, they have a tendency to move in tandem. It's very rare for someone to just be crushing it in business and really struggling in different aspects of life. I found that the more we focus and invest in ourselves, if I can get my health better, my business tends to follow, which is a very fortunate pattern. So talk to us about that recognition. I feel like it took me personally a long time to understand that we just want to hammer at that stone and work on our businesses. But when and where did you realize that all of these work together and that's the service you want to bring to the world?
Oh, it took me a little while to get there. I'm not going to lie. We think it's about doing. What can I do? What can I do? What kind of strategy do I need? But really, it is about, we're going to have to grow if we want our business to grow. And I had my own mentor. I was learning things, and it finally, I think we struggle long enough when we finally go, there has to be something besides the doing part. Otherwise, this isn't going to work. And so I started to realize that, all right, it has to be more about who I'm being. And really, it had to do with the mindset. I think that's the key. I started to realize that it's about the way we think, the things we learn, the conditioning we have, the things that are going on in our head that tells us we can't do it, we shouldn't do it, those kinds of things that keeps us focusing on doing rather than the other things we need to be paying attention to, like you said, the health aspect and the mindset piece.
Yeah, even hearing you say that out loud in my head, I always think like the listeners, and I wish that I could interject all of them into this conversation, but I hope to represent them on the air here today. And when I hear you talking about thinking, I feel like all too often we discount the fact that thinking is a proactive process. We have control over our thoughts and we can tap into those. Talk to us about that importance, because as entrepreneurs, I would argue that we face all the real life dilemmas and thoughts that everybody else does, but also we have all of these things that we are responsible for as business owners. So where does that proactive versus reactive versus recognition, how's that start to come into play when we want to take control of those thoughts and manifest them in a positive way?
Well, first you have to have awareness around it. You have to realize that that's the thing. You have to know to start paying attention to patterns. And most of us don't know that. Most of us can't see it in ourselves. And so we don't really understand that that's the thing that's happening. And then to compound that, a lot of the things that show up in business, we learned as a child, right? So those are things that we heard about business or money or what it takes to be successful. We learned a long time ago. And so now they're just coming out. And one of the greatest things I learned, which is super interesting, is that what you learned as a kid on the playground is not going to make you successful as an entrepreneur. So if I give you an example about that, think about some of the things you learn on the playground with other kids is about you have to be nice. And if you think about that even more, having to be nice means you don't want to upset anyone, or you don't want to talk about money, or you don't want to try to sell them something, because all those things make someone feel like you're not nice. But as an entrepreneur, you need to be able to do all those things. You have to look at those things differently. You have to look at sales as service, as something that is more of a gift than something that you're doing something to them. And so for me, and for what I realized, is that it's that small shift that as soon as you make that and go, okay, wait a second, something like selling someone something or offering to solve a problem is being nice to them. But that's the shift that needs to happen. And it's about learning that. It's really about having a mentor or reading books or having someone to really listen to start to shift that way of thinking. And then you go out and take the action.
Yeah, I love that you point that out. As someone who I've been into marketing since I was a teenager, and I always tell entrepreneurs with great products and services, you have an obligation to get great at marketing, because if your product or service helps people, then you're crazy and selfish, I would argue, to not get it in front of them. So I think that's a really powerful point, and you're right, a mindset shift for people to embrace. But I want to ask you this, Maureen, because when you talk about when we learn these things as children, I can't help but think about tennis, because as a tennis player, recreational tennis player, when I was working on my forehand with my tennis coach, my technique was terrible. And he said, okay, we need to break it down. We need to do it this way. And he shows me, but it's easier said than done, Maureen, because I've got thousands of reps of doing it the wrong way. It's going to take me thousands of reps to do it the right way. And so when you talk about awareness, seeing it is one thing, but what are the steps we can take? Because we're undoing, for all of us, decades of bad habits, bad behaviors, bad reps. How do we even start to address those things once we have that awareness?
Oh, that's a good question. Sometimes you need some help. Sometimes you need to have an outside perspective or someone to help you point it out. There's a lot of books that you can read, like Think and Grow Rich or The Science of Getting Rich, those kinds of things that start to put different ideas into your mind that cause you to go, wait a second, this actually could be a small shift, or that actually starts the awareness down the road, down to start to come in. And then you can take a look at what can I do, for example, learning a sales technique or learning marketing, like you said, or learning tennis, and just being able to approach it from a way, you know what, I can do this, rather than this is hard, or I'm never going to get there. You literally just take the first step and get going.
Yeah, it reminds me, my favorite Henry Ford quote ever is, whether you think you can or you can't, you're right. And I think that that's so powerful, and it shows in so much of the work that you do. But it leads me right to a word that you've already raised here in this conversation. It shows up so much in your work, is patterns and recognizing those patterns. Where does that come about, Maureen? Because obviously, as a really powerful coach and someone who helps others, you have a bit of an unfair advantage, that you have a great vantage point when you work with others. How do we start identifying those patterns, though? Is it something that once a week you take a step back and you have reflection time? Like, what do you journal about it? What are some of those ways that we can start to identify those patterns? And I'm going to make this question even deeper for you, is what types of patterns are you even looking for? What questions can we ask to start identifying them?
Okay, so you can look at what's the same result I get over and over, and why is that? And you reverse engineer it, and you look back and you go, well, I'm doing this, or I'm calling on these people, or I do the same thing every single time, or in marketing, I hire the same person. You'll start to notice them if you take a look at, what do I keep doing that's getting me the same result? You're then going to start to go, okay, so how can I approach this differently? And a lot of times it's having a collaborator to look at, why don't we try this? It's literally about trying something, like not to be afraid to fail, and let's just try what we think might work. We look at some of the greatest entrepreneurs and they've done that. And then you start to look at patterns. So you become aware of them. You have to take note of them. You have to be willing to try something else. And you also have to be willing to show up differently. So you've got to be bold. You've got to be willing to make that next step. You have got to be willing to set up a business with strategy and, for example, like programs and packages. What exactly does that look like? What are you offering? What are your results? What are the results that people are getting? And a lot of times people dismiss them. So you can have a business owner doing these amazing things in their business, and they don't talk about them, and all of a sudden they just go, oh, you know what, my client just doubled their income last month. And you're like, wait a second, hold on, they did what? And so you start paying attention to the results that show up, and then automatically over and over you're going to go, here's the sweet spot right there. Let's pay attention to that. And then you can go, okay, so how do I get to where I can do that again, or even teach people how to do that?
Yeah, I love that. And obviously it's a big part of what you can bring to the table, because you've seen it from the other side, which even hearing the way you talk about it here today, what's coming through to me is that the way you identify yourself, the labels that you adopt, is that of an experimenter, of someone who is just willing to try things. You said the word bold. You said it's important for us to be bold. And I think about all the entrepreneurs and so many entrepreneurs that we're so grateful to hear from in our audience all around the world at all different growth phases. And Maureen, what always pops up for me is the labels that they apply to themselves. And I think one of the more common ones that I hear is, oh, I'm a perfectionist. And these labels become barriers. I'm going to also call out maybe excuses for people to maybe not take action, to not try things. Talk to us about identity and those labels and the importance of them, and how you've managed over the course of your career and life to really shape it in a way that serves you as opposed to holding you back.
I actually teach the importance of not using labels, because you're going to identify with something that's going to actually become a deterrent rather than a motivator. So if you have someone, for example, say, well, I'm an introvert, it's like, okay, however, what that means then is that you don't want to go to networking and talk about your business. So let's remove that for a minute and see if we can't help you to be the person who needs to at least go talk about the business somewhere. Otherwise, you're not going to move forward. You can use that same with an extrovert, right? They can be very outgoing, but then at the same time, they don't necessarily take the time for well-being or to recharge. So I actually learned, but I also integrated that into who I am, into the business, and to go, it's not really helpful for us to claim an identity that isn't going to help us. So let's claim one that is, right? Like a successful entrepreneur is amazing. And we get to define what that looks like. Same like we would with success. We get to claim what that looks like for ourselves.
Yeah, I love that perspective, especially because I just feel like so much in the world of entrepreneurship, we're pushed towards accepting these global norms, and that's not always the case. One thing that I'll throw a little bit of shade at here in today's conversation is SMART goals. You know, specific, measurable, actionable, has a result tied to it and the timeline tied to it. It just seems to me like so often, I went to business school, and I remember sitting in business classrooms, and these professors were saying, you need to have a 5-year plan and a 10-year plan, and it just felt like I got overwhelmed in those moments of, well, holy cow, I can't control what's going to happen 10 years from now. Just look at 2020. When COVID rolled around, it threw a lot of different shifts in the way the world works, let alone how our businesses work. So I'd love to hear your perspective on goal setting or results or objectives or visions. How do you even start to begin to manifest the things that we want in life?
So, you know, a lot of people don't really know how to set a goal or what that actually looks like. And then they get caught up in the things, like you said, making them a SMART goal. So for me, what I like to do is have a vision. It's actually more intuitive, and it actually allows me to take a look at the longer term for what I want to create. And then I can take a look at, all right, so if I move it shorter, right, into a shorter time frame, I can go, here's the vision of what I'm working towards, and here's what I can then work on today that actually is going to get me there. And it isn't necessarily about a SMART goal, and I don't necessarily get hung up in is it needs to be measurable. I need to be able to see that I'm making progress for sure. I have to change my mindset around the word progress so that I can actually see it as a positive thing rather than a thing that's telling me I'm still so far away. I actually really like to work with my clients on a vision because it allows them to think bigger and create amazing things. Like, goals can do the same thing, but for me and the experience that I found, I was much more successful when I looked at things from the vision, which says, I look at this part of my life and I want this to happen over here. And I want to, be looking at health and business and relationships and family and all these things rather than just setting a goal for the business, which actually makes it much more fun for me, I think, and for the business owner when you look at it that way.
Yeah, I love that you pointed that out for our audience there about the fact that we actually, if we expand it to thinking about our vision rather than just these small goals, thinking bigger is always the solution. When I started flying a drone just for fun, for drone photography and videography, what I realized was your natural tendency is you want to fly that thing so low so that it's right there. It looks like it's within your grasp. You can protect it. But actually, the truth is, it's actually dangerous to fly low. There's electrical wires, there's buildings. It's way safer actually to fly high. And it's intimidating at first, but I think that you hit the nail on the head there. In life and in business, it's dangerous to think small. We'll always rise to the occasion of how big we think, or we'll shrink to how small our immediate goals are. So, Maureen, I love that insight from you. And it makes me want to ask you, because you said the word intuition. And Maureen, probably a lot of listeners are going to be listening to this thinking, well, you're very fortunate if you can follow your intuition because you trust it. And clearly you have good intuition. Where does that come from? For all those people who are afraid to listen to their intuition, what's your response to that?
Oh, gosh. You learn. I trust it and I teach my clients it. And it honestly is something you have to learn. And when your mindset is changing and you're growing and your business is going to grow, your intuition is too. And sometimes it's hard to discern what is the intuition and what isn't. And it takes practice, right? And so for me now, it's just something that I normally do, and it's something that I teach other people, but it wasn't always like that. It was something that I had to learn.
Yeah, which that in and of itself is a powerful lesson, that your intuition is just like a muscle with everything else. It can get better over time. There's no such thing as, oh, my intuition is off, or I don't have good intuition. So I love that perspective, Maureen. But it leads me to ask, because it's all of this is easier said than done, of course. I think about it in so many conversations that I have with amazing entrepreneurs, is the listeners thinking, I've got a full-time job, I've got a family, I've got kids I've got to take care of, whatever their life situation may be. They're probably wondering, Maureen, you're telling me to take care of business, of my health, of my wealth, of my life, of all of these things. How do we find that balance? I know work-life balance here in the United States is a common term. What's your approach to finding that balance in life? Or is it even about finding balance? I guess that's the real question.
I think it's more about creating it and knowing that it's going to change and evolve, and it might be a moving target, and it's something that you look at over time, so it gets built, and you might have a piece that comes in or a piece that goes out. And I also think that it's really important. So some of the things I teach is we take a look at balance based on what your values or what your priorities are, and then you have to trickle those down into your life, all the way down into your calendar. And a lot of people don't do that, and they don't necessarily use a calendar as well as they could. And so then you have to stick to it, right? So you have to be committed to actually creating the balance so that when something shows up, you're actually going to stick to it. For example, if you're sick and you have a doctor's appointment, you're not going to skip that. But if you have something set up, say with a colleague or someone at home, and something shows up, it's important to not drop that thing right away. Like you want to spend time with a family member, or your colleague needs something from you. You want to make sure that you keep that like you would a doctor's appointment. You can also shift something if something does come up, like an emergency to be taken care of, but then you want to make sure you come back to that piece that you dropped and actually take care of it, because otherwise pieces do get dropped. And then you're going to not put entirely too much pressure on yourself to try to have it be perfect. It's more like a continuum than anything else that actually is going to grow with you.
Yeah, Maureen, hearing you talk about, you just put a lot of importance on our calendars, for example. And for me in my life, if it's not in my calendar, it's not going to happen. I'm not going to be there. So I think that's such a powerful perspective. But I'm going to add a big observation from the outside looking in, is that what I think is really unique and powerful about your approach, and it shows in so many of the amazing results that you get your clients, is that you do combine the just pure business logistics and experience with also the things that we traditionally separate from all of that, which is manifestation, which is the spiritual side, which is the mindset side of it. Talk to us about why it seems like societally we separate these two so much. We've got the, one side of the brain strictly thinking about business and calendars and logistics and operations, and we separate that from the spiritual side of our world and our own personal development.
I think we've been trained to do that. I think business has been set up to be strategy. Work harder. It takes a long time to get there. I think that's what we've been trained to see until recently, where we started to bring in spiritual aspects for sales or the spiritual principles into it. And they are going to become more and more important, because you're going to have both. If you're just in the business strategy, that sort of focus, you're going to burn out. You're not going to get the results you want. It's going to just get harder. And eventually you're going to not be able to work any harder. Eventually you won't be able to have any more time. You need to bring in spiritual principles of things like trust and faith. And I will admit, I was doing it before I realized I was doing it, and I was a little resistant to actually instilling it into the business because it took me a little while to see exactly how it fit. And now there's just no other way. If you actually then take someone who is stuck, say, in a pattern like we were talking about before, or their mindset is about lack or scarcity, and you're trying to teach them about abundance or making more money than they've ever had, part of that is going to require faith.
Yeah, for sure. And for me, it's really fun to get to talk to you today because, I mean, obviously I've gone through your website, read so many of your testimonials, and then seeing it and hearing it in action here today when you talk about implementing all of these things from spirituality to faith to the business principles, everything we're talking about today, it leads me to ask you this question about your clients is, what's that spark? What's that catalyst? For most people, when they eventually reach out to you, we talk about breaking through to that next level. Where's that recognition come from them? What's the breaking point where they say, all right, Maureen, I need you. I need your help. Because a lot of people experience it, but not everyone actually takes that step to get help.
You're right. Usually it's about money. Usually it's about they don't have enough money to pay for their life currently. And they know, when people reach a point where they know that they could be doing so much more and have greater success than they currently have, they just can't get there. And usually it has to do with money, and then the other things come in first, or come in after that. Like the health shows up later, or relationships will show up in a conversation. The majority of the time it has to do with money, or it has to do with they don't understand how to run the business. They don't understand the strategy part. They don't understand the change in thinking that has to happen from having a job to becoming an entrepreneur. And so they need someone then to help them with those things.
Yeah, it makes sense. These are huge transition moments where we're figuring all the things out. So that's really cool that they find you and that you're able to guide them through that, which a lot of people probably have never experienced coaching on such a deep and intimate level, like the deep work that you do with your clients. Paint that picture for us. For people who have heard coaches talk, whether it be on podcasts or YouTube videos, and they're thinking, what are these like? Are these like therapy sessions? Do I sit on a couch on a Zoom call and talk to Maureen about my problems? What does coaching actually look like, Maureen?
Okay, so it's a little bit different from therapy. And really what this is you and I are going to be partners in creating what it is you want to create. So I have a one-on-one coaching program where we're going to meet every week. And what that looks like is I'm going to bring something to the table for you, and you're going to bring something to the table for me. You'll have a question, you'll have an objective, you might have a problem that you keep bumping up against that you can't see a solution to. And then I'll take something intuitively or from a previous call and come to the call with it as well. Could be a question, could be a, hey, what about this? Or something that I notice that you keep repeating that is an amazing result for a client. We'll talk about that. And it then can evolve from there into talking about a problem, talking about, okay, here's something that's going amazing. How do we build upon it? But it's you might bring up something from childhood, you might bring up something from a past relationship, but we really are focusing on how do I get you from where you are to where you want to go? And that really is the point for us.
Yeah, well then, Maureen, I have to ask you this question while we're on the air, because not only do I know that you're brilliant at all of these things, but I also know you have a brilliant business mind. And so with that, how the heck do you keep track of all this stuff? Just from a logistics perspective, it sounds like you've got so many notes and files and ways to recognize these patterns for all of your clients and with all of your clients. Do you have tools that keep all of this in track for you? What is the way that you find to be organized in service of your clients?
So I do have some tools. I have some worksheets. I also have a system that I use. There's 12 steps in the system. Not everyone will go through all of them because they don't need them. And it is actually kind of varies for each client, kind of where they are when they come in. I take really good notes. I have computer, a lot of it's on the computer. The client actually does some of that as well. So there'll be not necessarily an intake form, but there'll be a form every week. So there is a log there. And I just make sure I keep track as best I can for what's developed.
Yeah, for sure. Gosh, a lot that goes on in your mind, I'm sure, Maureen. And the fact that you keep it all in line is truly incredible and remarkable, especially seeing the results that you get for people. I'll just say it for listeners, because we're obviously going to drop your link at the end of today's episode, but it just sounds to me like you genuinely go deep with them, whether it comes to business, whether it comes to life, but also what I see is even people in their executive careers, you help them become high performers. So I want to ask you this, and I know there's probably not one way to answer this specifically, but what's the top thing, especially in the scope of entrepreneurship that we're talking about here today? What's the thing that you see people struggling with the most? Because it's easy for me to imagine you have very sound sales principles and the mindset to go along with it. I know we receive a lot of questions from listeners about sales related things, but from your perspective, working with so many people, what are the common things that people struggle with?
Well, there would be closing a sale, for sure. There would be things like marketing, meaning how do I talk about my business so I can set it up in a certain way. That doesn't necessarily mean I know how to communicate about it. They have, I don't want to say problems, challenges in their relationships that affected the way they do business. But usually it has to do with the business side of it, setting it up, framing it correctly. How do I do the sales? How do I ask for money? How do I feel okay about asking for money? How do I set my rates so that I'm getting what I need and what I'm worth, and then feel good about it? We have a lot of beliefs around money that keep us from asking for what we deserve or asking for what we need when it comes to that. And so those are some of the things that people struggle with. And a lot of it isn't necessarily taught. Like the things we're taught in school aren't necessarily, what we need to know to run a business. And there's a lot of information on social media now, which is really great, but it also can be a deterrent. So I tell people, like, you get a 15-minute limit. Go search for something and you get 15 minutes, because otherwise you're going to go down a rabbit hole. And really what you want to do is find your way to make a different decision rather than getting stuck and analyzing the one you just made before.
Yeah, super important. Action over motion. It's a topic I've long been obsessed with. James Clear talks about it a lot in a lot of his writings, and I think it's so important. But what I really love about your answer there is that you brought it somewhere that you're right. We talked about it earlier in our conversation. Most people don't want to go there. Most people don't want to talk about money. It's coached out of us, and I love the fact that you are coaching it right back into people, Maureen. So we're going to drop your links in just a minute, but I always love closing these conversations with a super broad question so you can take it in any direction that you want, and that is, what's your one piece of advice? Knowing that we're being listened to by wantrepreneurs and entrepreneurs all over the globe at different stages of their growth journeys, what's the one thing that you want to impart on them after dropping so much amazing wisdom with us here today?
Oh gosh, there's so many. I will say this: start before you're ready and learn along the way. So many people get hung up on, I got to be prepared, I got to get all my ducks in the row, I got to have this and I got to have that. That's just a stall tactic. Just start. Just get going and just start. You know more than you think you do, and so start before you're ready.
Yes, I love that. Super important advice. And I would actually argue that part of being ready is just to start doing. It's actually a step in the process, not a step before the process. So huge kudos to you, Maureen. I think it's a solid reminder for all of us. And before I throw it back to you to drop those links on us on where listeners should go from here, I just want to directly tell listeners, on your website is so much of the powerful stuff that we talked about here today, with really direct language and messaging, inviting us to think bigger, to be better. I think it's so cool the way that you've articulated the powerful and transformational work that you've done. Listeners, one of my favorite things, there's a box right on Maureen's website that says our target areas that set us apart from other coaches. Here's a sampling of them, and it lists out, and wealth building, for example, is one of those things that Maureen touches on. So if you've never gone deep into someone because it's been coached out of you to talk about money, Maureen has shared so much with us here today in today's episode. So Maureen, for listeners who want to go deeper, drop those links on us. My favorite link of all, especially. I love your website domain. So where should listeners go from here?
So the website is a great spot, and you mentioned it, worklesscreatemore.com. And also LinkedIn, they can find me, Maureen Considine, on LinkedIn. It's probably the best two places.
Yes, listeners, you already know the drill. We are making it as easy as possible for you to find Maureen's business website as well as her personal LinkedIn. If you want to reach out to her, don't be shy because, spoiler alert, 99% of listeners are shy and are afraid to reach out to any creators and guests that they ever listen to on any platform. So you see how much Maureen loves this. And if you want to tap into her intuition, which is comprised of all of her experience, not only for herself, but with all of her clients, check out her business website at worklesscreatemore.com, as well as her personal LinkedIn. You'll find those links down below in the show notes. Otherwise, Maureen, on behalf of myself and all the listeners worldwide, thanks so much for joining us on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.